All right, this is Chris Shiflett. You might be looking at your phone thinking, what is this brand new episode of Walking the Floor? This podcast has been dormant for years, right? And who is George Gascon? I'm not familiar with his music. This is a music podcast, right? Well, let me explain. I've had this idea for a little while now about starting a new show that's more focused on politics and policy, but I don't have a setup to put that out yet. I don't even have a name. I don't really even have a fully formed idea. But the opportunity came up to interview our district attorney right here in Los Angeles, George Gascon, who is currently in a re-election fight. You may have heard there's a big election next week. So I wanted to get this out fast. So, I know politics isn't everybody's bag. If it's not yours and this upsets you, just delete it off your phone and don't listen. But if you're somebody that is interested, I think Gascon is a really interesting, smart guy. He's an immigrant himself. He's a vet. He started out as a LAPD patrol officer, worked his way all the way up to chief of police in Mesa, Arizona, and San Francisco. He's currently, like I said, the DA here in LA, and he gets blamed for an awful lot. And that's why I wanted to interview him, because I just wanted to hear from him. Sort of, here's what people accuse you of and hold you responsible for. How does the actual policy, and specifically the reforms that you've put into place since you've been in office, how do those policies work and what has their impact been? I'm a little out of shape to do a political interview. I haven't done one for a while, but I really enjoyed this, and I hope you enjoy it too. Check it out. Here we go. All right, I am going to use my cheat sheet quite a bit here because I found I normally do a podcast on guitar playing, which is a very comfortable thing to talk about. For policy and legal issues, I'm a bit out of my depth, so I need to.
So if I was talking about guitar, I would want to have that.
Exactly.
This
right?
I can do it with my eyes closed.
Yeah. So I the whole idea with this is I wanted to kind of get into the disparity between how people perceive politics and policy versus the realities of those policies and how they're implemented and what the impacts are. But also, I kind of want to get into motive, because when people yell at each other about politics, they always assign motive to things. Gascon he's soft on crime because he cares more about criminals than all that. I'm sure you've heard those kind of.
Of course.
Right. So let's just, before we get into all that, why don't we do a quick your background for people listening that don't know. You're a police officer, police chief, San Francisco DA, all that sort of stuff.
No, first of all, thanks so much for having me. This is fun. This is a really cool place.
Yeah.
You guys are going to have a hard time getting rid of us here.
Well, thanks for taking the time to do this. I'm sure you've got better things to do than talking to me.
Yeah, but my family immigrated here from Cuba in the late 60s. I grew up in a place called Carajay, which is southeast LA County, near Southgate, Bell, that area there. I was a monolingual Spanish speaker. I, was not a good student. I dropped out of high school.
We have that in common.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and, I started, sometimes really hanging around with the wrong crowd too. And really what kind of, turned my life around, I went to the Army. And, I was in the Army. I was fortunate enough to have a lot of support while I was there. I started, got my high school diploma, started getting some college, went to the rank of sergeant, and then when I got out of the Army, I went to Cal State Long Beach. I was planning to teach, but wound up in the police department, interestingly enough, LAPD, and, did a career in LAPD, rising through the rank of a patrol officer all the way to assistant chief before I was recruited, and I wound up in Mesa, Arizona, which is the third largest city in the state, as the chief of police. And I was there for 3 years. And when I was there, there was a guy, so the city of Mesa is within the Maricopa County. And there was a sheriff there, a guy named Joe Arpaio, who was a very anti-immigrant, I would argue xenophobic to a great extent. And they were really targeting primarily, Mexican-American families and Mexican families there, because that's where most of the Latino community there was at the time. And working with immigration, there were a lot of deportations. And the way that I sort of bump into this is when I have the superintendent of the school district in the city calls me and say, hey, I'm having a problem with school attendance because anytime there's immigration raised by the sheriff in the city, the parents won't bring their kids to school. And, schools in Arizona are funded like kind of they are in California, where daily attendance is how they get their money. So that impacted the funding, which impacted, all kinds of sorts of programs. And she wanted to know what to do. And that started my, pushing back on the sheriff and his immigration rates. And that, that kind of came a thing in Arizona at the time. And I was asked to go to the U.S. Congress to provide testimony about the abuses that were going on there. And that led actually to, being asked to leave Mesa. And, our current governor was the mayor of San Francisco. He recruited me at the time. Then the chief of police was leaving. I got recruited. I went there to the chief of police. I met hopefully our next president, Kamala Harris. She was the DA there, and then we worked together. And then when she became the attorney general for the state, I wound up getting her job. I did go to law school in the middle of all this. I went to law school when I was in the police department. But throughout the years, I started getting into more criminal justice reform and looking to do work differently. And that's sort of the path that led me to where I am here today.
Well, coming from the background being an actual patrol officer, what were the reforms that needed to happen?
Yeah, having gone from being a patrol officer all the way to running police departments, what became evident to me as time went by, as I matured, became more, more of a student of the trade, if you will. Not only looking at what we were doing here, but what other countries are doing. I was fortunate enough to do a lot of traveling with policing, do a lot of work nationally too in different settings. It became very clear to me that incarceration and public safety are not always necessarily synonymous, right? I mean, there is no question there are people that are dangerous and they have to be separated from the rest of us, or people that commit harm that need to sort of pay their debt to society. So those things are, I'm totally in agreement, and I think it's necessary. By the way, I believe in good policing and good, I believe in rehabilitation in the prisons, but I'm not an abolitionist. But I also recognize that there's so much data and science today that speaks to the fact that over-incarceration actually begins to create more insecurity, because the more you incarcerate people, especially for low-level offenses, initially what you do is you increase the likelihood that that person is going to be committing other crimes, and increasingly more serious crimes that then cause more insecurity for all of us.
So can you talk a little bit about what exactly is a progressive DA?
Yeah, and look, to be honest with you, I'm a little ambivalent about the term, because I think that the term often conveys being soft on crime, being you don't care about victims, which is really far from the truth.
Sure.
To the contrary. But I think that the most people that sort of are in this world would provide certain commonalities. And I think that some of the commonalities are that, we are a group of people that generally believes that, rehabilitation should be firmly implanted in the system, because it reduces the likelihood of people committing crimes over and over again. I think that we also generally agree that, things like the war on drugs were complete failures, right? We criminalize a lot of people in our communities, especially a lot of young people of color, for things that, could be better handled through, public education, public health, and then frankly also understanding that, much like alcohol, there may be certain consumption of drugs that is recreational, and some people know how to manage that, and some people know, and there are some drugs that are extremely dangerous and deadly, and others are not, right? Not all drugs are created equal. I remember when people used to think that, the marijuana was a gateway to, using more dangerous or harmful drugs. And I think that most people now, that was a bunch of BS, right?
Right.
But, we criminalize a lot of people for marijuana use. I mean, when I started in policing, that was a felony, right? So I worked really hard, for instance, to lower the consequences, initially lowering the consequences of marijuana convictions, and then eventually the legalization. So I think that, most progressive prosecutors say, these are some things that didn't work, right? They're not create any more safety. I think that most of us will agree, for instance, that kids don't belong in adult prisons, right? When we put a 15, 16-year-old into an adult prison, they're going to mingle with people that are much more dangerous, more hardened. And by the time they come out, they're going to be in a worse place than when they went in. I remember talking to a young man that went to adult prison at age 16 and says, when you go into a prison as a kid, you either become a predator or prey. So he said, I decided to be a predator because I was not going to be anybody's prey. Well, what does that mean? That means that he started, joining the gangs and being a badder ass than the other guys, right? So he spent the next 20 years in prison doing that, and then finally hit the light came up, once he was already in his, late 30s, early 40s, and he said, well, I don't have anything to prove anymore, and then he started to come around and finally got out of prison, but that wasn't necessary, right? We probably didn't have to pay millions of dollars to have this guy in prison, especially he had committed basically some drug offenses that, were the result of being in the neighborhood and being stupid, but not necessarily being a hardened criminal, right? So, and what happens, he got arrested multiple times, and eventually, he wound up being in prison for a long period of time. So I think that most progressive will probably say, that's not a good use of public resources.
So what would you say, what were the key policy differences between you and the DA that was in office prior to Lacey?
So for instance, she put 24 people on death row. I'm against the death penalty. Okay? She put hundreds of kids into adult prisons. I try not to because I don't think that works. She widely used enhancements that multiply the years in prison. So it's not like you're not going to go to prison, but maybe instead of going to prison for 10 years, you add on enhancements, pretty soon you're going to prison for 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, can you explain that a little? What is an enhancement?
So let's say, for instance, that you grew up in a area that has a lot of gangs, right? And, and this is where people that live in those neighborhoods understand this. You become a gang associate, and sometimes you become a gang member, right? Now, not all gang members are equally dangerous, right? It's like anything else. Some of them are, some of them are not. But you get, you become part of the gang files, and then you commit you do something stupid, like you steal a car, maybe you steal something from you break in somebody's home or whatever. But in addition to that, now you're in the gang file, right? So and I'm using hypotheticals here, but let's say that whatever you did was maybe worth 5 years in prison. But we add on the gang enhancements, and all of a sudden you have 10 years in prison, right? And then maybe if you had a gun in your possession, even though you didn't use the gun to commit the crime, you just had the gun because you think you need it for personal protection. Now, I disagree with that most of the time, but people in the neighborhoods think sometimes they don't have a gun, they're going to get hurt. So he's a gang member with a gun, you add another 10 years, right? So pretty soon what was going to be a 5-year prison becomes 25 or 30 years, right? And you start multiplying that by hundreds and hundreds of people, and pretty soon you really create a huge prison population. And the question is, does that person needed to go for prison that long? In some cases, maybe so, but many others, they don't. So my predecessor used a lot of those. Then, listen, I'm a cop, right? I like good policing. I tell people that I'm LAPD through and through. But when policing violates the law, when they use excessive force, when they lie on the stand, they need to be held accountable. Often prosecutors think that the relationship with police needs to be so tightly knitted that it's hard for them to prosecute a police officer when they commit a crime. Under the prior administrations, there were cases of excessive use of force, including deadly force, lying on the stand. There were many things that were going on, and the police was not being held accountable. We have said, look, we're supporting good policing, and we do every day. But, if you use excessive force and it rises to the level of criminal conduct, we're going to prosecute you. And we prosecuted out about 156 officers, including about 15 for use of force, 7, I believe, for use of deadly force. By comparison, 22 years prior, there were no such prosecutions, right? The other thing that I think that we differ greatly is when it comes to the environment and when it comes to waste theft. So, the biggest theft crime in our county today, over $1 billion a year, is money that's stolen from workers by unscrupulous employers that are not paying their overtime. They may not pay their full salary. And, people say, well, that only impacts maybe low-wage workers, which is bad enough, right? They're being ripped off. But it impacts all of us, right? Because if you're a good employer, you're paying your employees, good living wages, and you're paying the medical insurance and all that stuff. Let's say I want to build a house, and I'm comparing your price as a good contractor. I'm comparing the price of someone else that is going to not pay their workers right. You're not gonna get the bid if I go strictly on how much the person is willing to take for the job, because they're paying a lot less. So they're ripping off the good employer at the expense of all of us. And then when you look at payroll taxes and all that stuff, which goes on to pay for policing and streets and schools and all that stuff, that also gets so. We now prosecuted, employers for this. And, we have recovered salary, about $3 million in overtime and other wages, and criminally prosecuted employers that were not done so before. When it comes to the environment, we got over 250 cases involving environmental violations, including really egregious cases where we had one case, a metal recycler that had been for years polluting the water and the soil at an adjacent high school, to the point that the EPA tested the lead content on the soil at the football field, and it was 75 times more than a human should have been in contact with. And when you understand that, when lead gets into your skeletal system, which, high exposure to it will get to that point, that lead will stay 3 generations out, meaning you, your kids, and your grandkids. Even if you stop the exposure, after it's in your system, it will transfer to the next 2 generations. And this was going on for decades, and prior DAs were given an opportunity to do something about it. They didn't. We're doing consumer stuff, in ways that the prior DA didn't quite do it. We just went after Home Depot, Albertson, and Bonds with other retailers. With other DAs, but they were basically, like they have a sale, right? You can buy a hammer for $10 today, right? But it comes Saturday, the hammer costs $15, but they don't move the tag on the shelf. So you go pick up the hammer, and you pick up nails, and you pick up a screwdriver, and you drop all that in the counter. You're not counting on this thing. You're paying $15 for the $10. You thought you were paying $10 for the hammer. Now you multiply that hundreds of times. They're stealing a lot of money from all of us. So we went after Home Depot for that. We did it also with Bonds and Albertson. And it's interesting because they'll often say, well, it's just sloppy inventory control and stuff. But, there is another component to that, right? They are cutting down the number of employees that they have on the floor, which also contributes to retail theft, because the unions will tell you when you have a fully staffed store staff, people are less likely to steal. But when there's no one around and you have an automatic checkout, then that's when you get a lot of problems. So they're cutting costs in how many employees they hire. They're stealing from the consumer. And they're not being held accountable. So we went after some of these people for that kind of stuff as well. Lamps Are Us, we prosecuted them, again, with some other DAs, because they would tell you, if you find this lamp anywhere else for more than what we sell it for, for less, we'll give you 125% back of your thing. So you say, oh, geez, they won't do that unless I'm getting this lamp for that price. Who's going to take that chance? What you don't understand is the lamp that they're telling you cannot find anywhere else, because they make them, right? And the stuff that somebody else is making, the prices are fixed, because most of the manufacturers would tell the retailer you cannot sell it below this price. But you go in there thinking, and how many of us are going to buy a lamp and then go home and check around and see if anybody sells it for less, right? But you're getting ripped off, because the reason why you went there is because you thought, if this was being sold for more somewhere else, they'd give me 125% back. And by the way, when people do find out and try to get their 125% back, they jack them around for ages, right?
Well, it's interesting. Like, I never thought about any of those issues. You just talked about, because you don't see that on Twitter. You see retail smash and grab, right? So what's bigger? I mean, obviously, like the stuff that people focus on and think about are the headline grabbing, the stuff we see every day, or we think we see every day on social media and out in the street, homeless encampments and things like that. So do voters even know about
listen,
I've never thought about any of those types of crime that you just
most voters
mentioned.
don't realize that. In fact, there's more money being stolen by consumers in the retail process than any prices that get jacked up because of organized retail theft. And by the way, we don't minimize organized retail theft, right? We have gone after, we work with our local agencies. We have prosecuted now nearly 15,000 cases of organized retail theft. And what people often don't understand, the prosecutor doesn't patrol, doesn't make arrests, right? We can only prosecute what the cops bring you. 92% of the cases that the police officer have brought in front of us for this stuff, we prosecute, which is a very high. The average prosecution rate for most crimes is around 60%. So we're really focusing on that. But what the retailers often won't tell you, or the Retailers Association, is they don't have a way to quantify retail theft. And the reason why they don't, is because they have a thing called inventory shrinkage. And inventory shrinkage includes employee theft, which, by the way, is deemed to be the largest loss to a retailer, is employee theft. Bad accounting, meaning bad inventory accounting, and then shoplifting, right? In that order. But because of the way the retailers quantify this is inventory shrinkage, they really have no real way of telling you what's what.
Well, how does specifically that, like, smash and grab and retail theft, how does that wind up? Because what I hear all the time from people, be it like right-wing kind of reactionary people, or even a lot of my liberal friends, is, the police aren't allowed to arrest anybody anymore. Yeah. And that's why these people are running into these stores. So where does that idea come from? And is there an actual policy that you can point to that makes that the current law of the land?
There's no policy to the contrary. First of all, it requires police arrest for a prosecutor to take action. Now, if you're in the city of LA, like here, if the theft is a misdemeanor theft, it's going to go to the city attorney. So we don't even get to take a look at it. We only deal with felony. But now when you're talking about smash and grab, which is usually several people going and taking a bunch of property, that's a felony that comes to us, and we're prosecuting those cases about 92% of the time.
You are prosecuting those cases.
Yeah,
why do your opponents accuse you of not prosecuting those crimes?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's like,
and that idea has seeped out into the public, right?
Totally. Yeah. And frankly, the media sometimes contributes to this because they don't do the heavy lifting of looking beyond the salacious images of a group who went into a store. And by the way, this is not a local problem. This is a national problem. In fact, a lot of the smash and grab crews that are operating in our city are operating in all the neighboring counties. We have DAs that are, quote-unquote, the law and order folks. And per capita, we actually have lower levels of a lot of these crimes that they do. But, it's a narrative. It's just like Donald Trump says that, Kamala Harris is south on the border, right? Or that Biden doesn't have a border policy, right? I mean, it's the same thing. It's sales, it's a fear-mongering that often, unfortunately, takes hold of the cultural narrative, if you will, in communities, and that grows, right? And it gets exponentially, presented to others, and especially we now with social media, with Ring cameras, with Nextdoor, you have all these platforms where people take one story, it gets repeated, and obviously it gets increasingly more problematic as it goes from one person to the other. And it becomes a reality, even though when it isn't. Or you have one image of a smash and grab, but it gets repeated 1,000 times. You get to see it maybe 50 or 60 times. So you say, oh, my God, what's going on here?
What control do you have, sort of directly or indirectly, over policing policy?
Yeah, look, I mean, we have some indirect control, right? And the indirect control is as follows. For instance, when we say, look, if you have a history of lying or racist behavior, under the law, we're required to provide that information when you make an arrest if we're prosecuting to the defense, because they may show that you're biased one way or the other. And by the way, the law requires that. My predecessor tried to look for every way possible not to find this out so she did not have to report it. We, on the other hand, said, we won and we need this, and if you don't give it to us, we're going to demand it, right? So that all of a sudden alters the behavior. Police department, okay, who's going to work patrol? Who's going to make arrests? Because if they have this history in them, they may not be a good witness. We may not be able to use them as a witness. When we're prosecuting police officers for excessive force, police officers start thinking, hey, I got a guy looking over my shoulder that if I step over the line, I may face criminal consequences, right? And, I always distinguish between street crimes and sort of the white-collar crime. And I would call, sort of public official corruption, whether it's a council member stealing or a police officer using excessive force, more of the white-collar crime, I call it. For people that are in our world, consequences of going to prison are a deterrent, right? We were not raised thinking that I'm going to get some street creds by going to prison, right? A cop doesn't think, I'm going to be better off by going to prison, right? So that is a huge deterrent. Whereas kids that are on the street, sometimes actually going to prison means, you all of a sudden start building up your creds, right? So very little deterrent there. Plus, truthfully, whether it's police or the kids on the street, most people don't think they're going to get caught, right? But there's more of a deterrent on the white collars side of it. So knowing that there's somebody looking over your shoulders, I think it alters your behavior. Also, demanding that there will be good probable cause. That when an arrest is made, that is tightly done according to the law. That's going to impact the behavior of how police is going to make an arrest.
Well, I guess I was more sort of thinking, do your policies have a direct impact on police policy, whether or not they go out and make arrests for these like smash and grab?
Yeah, well, I think
retail theft stuff?
I mean, it shouldn't, right? I mean, there's certainly nothing. And first of all, in the city of LA, if it's a misdemeanor, it's not even my office. But when you look at the serious side of it, the organized retail theft, we're prosecuting 92% of this. We have actually prosecutors assigned to review their work with the task forces. So we're right there. We're helping with this. So, the number of arrests that we see are greater on this area than they were under the prior administration. Obviously, the problem nationally has grown. And it's grown, by the way, because we now increasingly have a way to sell large quantities of stolen goods on social media, on Amazon, and there is no checks and balances. So if you go back 20 years ago or even less, by and large, if somebody stole a bunch of stuff, they sold it out of the trunk of their car, maybe they sold it at a swap meet, right? But there was not this place that had mass distribution of goods without any checks and balances. So one of the things that I did earlier this year, I worked with legislatures and the governor signed legislation that starting January 1, places like Amazon or Facebook or Instagram Marketplace or eBay, they have to actually confirm that you have a right to the property you're selling, which is going to start reducing the capacity to sell stolen property in these platforms.
Is police pullback a factor in this?
Here's a couple of things that I think are important to note. Policing is having a horrible recruitment problem nationwide.
Yeah, why is that?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. Number one, I think that demographically, the pool that we recruit police officers from, which is going to be younger people that are going to be U.S. citizens, and they're going to never been arrested and all that pool is shrinking, right?
But
we're getting
it's
older.
not a budgeting issue, right? The
No,
money's
it's not.
there, but they can't get the candidates.
By and large, the money is there, right? It's just simply there's not as many young people that want to work in policing today that there were maybe when I was a police officer. Number two, in addition to the demographics of it, I think that there has been so much bad publicity around policing in the last few years that, especially after George Floyd, that a lot of young people that may have considered being a cop say, I don't want to do that, right? So I think that's creating a huge recruitment problem, and you see that reflected nationwide. But here in our own county, the sheriff's department and the LAPD are down hundreds of people. By the way, it's impacting prosecutions as well. There are DA's offices around the country that are down 20-30%. We're down about 10%, which is probably normal attrition for an office of our size. But we're recruiting, quite frankly, a lot of non-traditional people that normally would not go into the prosecution side. But overall, prosecutors, DAs, police are having a struggle recruiting today.
But are police departments themselves engaging in pullback as a way of thwarting reforms? I know that might get a little conspiratorial. Maybe you don't want to talk about it. But
look, I don't doubt that there may be times in the community where that occurs. They say in Ferguson, they often talk about I don't know if you ever heard of the Ferguson effect.
Sure.
But after Ferguson, police sort of nationwide, but certainly they really slow down a great deal.
Well, I think that happened in San Francisco with Chesa Bowden.
It happened nationwide, right, at different places, right? So I think you see some of that, but I think when you look at, sort of where the law is today and where the crimes are, I think by and large, I don't see a lot of slowing down. I do hear a lot, especially in the low-level crimes, cops saying, well, I'm not going to do anything about it because they're going to get in and get out of jail, right? And we hear that a lot with shoplifting, low level. And the problem that I say to police officers and police departments, and, someone having been a cop for a long time, when I was a young cop, we blamed the liberal judges, right? You always find somebody to blame for. The reality is that, you get paid to do the job. And just because a crime is no longer a felony, it's a misdemeanor, doesn't mean that you don't make an arrest. Because also there's a lot of data that shows that sometimes just making the arrest is enough to abate the behavior. And you don't get to worry about whether they get in or get. People have been getting in and out of jail all the time. You do your work, you do it well, and let the other components of the system, let the prosecutor, let the courts and juries decide. But when you look the other way and you say, well, I'm not going to do this because I don't like dealing with small stuff, then we have problems. And, in the police department, we used to have a saying, when I was a cop, he says, a lot of cops want to be elephant hunters, right? And if it was a low-level crime, you kind of let it go because you want to go get the robbery or in my days, a lot of dope, which was really so stupid, but we did. And I don't mean like people selling quantities of drugs. I'm talking some person with some drugs in the car. But, that is a cultural problem in policing, but that is not anything that it's more of, how do you train your police department? How do you lead them to understand that, a misdemeanor is still a crime. It doesn't mean that every misdemeanor that you see, you should make an arrest, but you should not make an arrest because you think the misdemeanor consequences are not worth your time.
I mean, if the police wind up having to be kind of de facto social workers, oftentimes these days dealing with homeless people and mental health issues and drug addiction issues and all that stuff, it seems logical to me that that's not what they want to spend their time doing. They want to spend their time being police. Why are police departments so resistant to reforms?
Well, because I think there's a couple of things there to unpack, so let's take the social worker piece of it. I am actually a strong supporter of redesigning the way that we address those things and not have the police deal with a lot of the stuff, right?
Well, that was kind of, to me, like the great loss of the sort of Black Lives Matter, defund the police moment.
Yeah.
It turned into this vague slogan that was used as a cudgel to kind of kill off reforms.
Yep.
When it was such it was a much more nuanced conversation.
100%, most of the time. So I think that there's so much that you are absolutely right. The cops don't generally want to do. That's not what they signed up for. And frankly, they're not well equipped, right? They're not social workers. They're not mental health professionals. I think we put them in a really unfair place. And we should find ways to decouple, traditional policing from that work. There are good economic and social reasons for doing so. I think, on the other hand, I think that, we generally pay our police very well. And, we expect a certain level of maturity and sophistication that entertains us. Sometimes you're going to have to do those things that may not be what you signed up for, assuming that there is such a thing as what you signed up for, right? So I believe that structurally we need to sort of move police away from some of the services. And I think that most cops would tell you that they would welcome that. But I think also police departments need to understand sometimes you might be the last resort. And, and I often compare police with the military, maybe because I was in the military and I believe in a strong and well-funded and well-structured military for our defense. In a democracy, the military and the police work for civilian authorities, right? Not the other way around. You want to go to dictatorships where the military runs a place or the cops are here, they shouldn't. So the job of the police or the job of the military in their respective spaces is to implement the policies that our civilian representatives has said that they want to do, right? And what I often see and we see that in the military stays in their lane most of the time. It's much professionalized in certain ways. When it comes to policing, because there's a big spectrum of who can be a leader in policing. Sometimes people with, quite frankly, not a great deal of education or any, a lot of other building up to reach to that level. It's almost like it becomes a force in itself, right? And then because we have police labor organizations that, like all labor organizations, they try to exert political pressure and they put a lot of money there.
To that point, with most public policy, you can follow a money trail. Yep. So is there a financial incentive for police unions and tough on crime prosecutors to resist reforms?
100%. Look, if you look at the whole process as being also a business, you have to understand that prisons. And I'm not even going to talk about private prisons. That's a whole different animal. Clearly, those are an enterprise. But, supporting a prison system, right, there are a lot of communities, a lot of businesses that depend on that, right? You have the people that supply food, the people that supply medical services. You go on and on and on. You go
all that's privatized, too, for people that don't realize that.
All that is privatized, right? And then you understand that in order to feed all of that, you have to have people that are prison guards or police officers. And the more that you have people in those organizations, the larger the budget for the labor organization they're representing is, because it's usually, like in the case of policing, most cops pay between 1.25% of their salary goes to the union, right? That builds up some big pots. And then, the more sophisticated unions go out and they buy real estate. I mean, in San Francisco, they even own a nightclub, which I don't know how you can get to do that, right? But they did. So then the next thing that comes with that level of money is political access, right? So you have people running for city council, people running for mayor, frankly, some people running for district attorneys, as my opponent has. And, there's a big pot of money there that they pay to support you or they pay against your opponent. And there are many city council members that are horrified to cross paths with their police union because the police union can make them or break them. The problem with that is the same people that are going to determine how much we budget for policing, what their salaries are going to be, what their pension systems are going to be, are the same people that depend on these people for political contributions. And that's why you often see cities overspending when you look at their total budget, not only in the police department and the front end, the operational side of it, but the back end lawsuits and pensions and all that other stuff that people don't even get to see, and that often get completely out of whack because we have people that are in city councils. Generally, they're there for 1 or 2 terms max because they're termed out. They're only thinking about the next office. They're not thinking that maybe the contract that they agreed to today is going to create such a financial liability for the next generations of people in that city, and that's going to cost 20 or 30 years so much money that they may not be able to fix the trees or trim the trees or pay for the parks, because increasingly the size of the budget is being taken by police services.
And wasn't Prop 47 supposed to direct money, like money saved on incarceration, back into community services? Like, did that actually happen? And has there been, what's the impact of that been?
Yeah, so about between $80 and $100 million a year, about $1 billion have been returned to communities in the last 10 years. And that money gets broken down to several pots. But the largest one, it goes for reentry and rehabilitation, drug rehab. There is a pot that goes for after-school programs, and there's a few other smaller dollar amounts. That money is a savings from what we had before, where we had to send more people to prison, because if you have possession of a small quantity of drugs, it was a felony. Let's say you had coke, even a coke pipe with just a residue from coke was enough to send you to state prison for 2 or 3 years. The savings from that, because that became a misdemeanor, which you could only go to local jail for a few days, then was computed, and that money came back to communities based on the size of their communities. So the county of LA every year have taken, literally hundreds of millions of dollars in the last 10 years. One of the problems, by the way, is that there is now Proposition 36 that wants to unwind a lot of this. And they tell, we're going to have massive treatment. But they said, but by the way, if you get caught with drugs 3 times and the third time, we can send you to prison. There is no money for any treatment in Prop 36. And the state legislative analyst has already said, look, if you do this, all the savings from Prop 47 are going to go back to prisons. So there's going to be even less money for services, even though we don't even have enough money today.
If that money is coming back to cities and going into various community services, why does it appear to average citizens that things are just continuing to unravel and get worse?
Well,
what's the disconnect there? Is it that there's just that the entire infrastructure of this city and like just about every major city in America right now is just sagging under too many people, too much crime, or like it? You see what I'm getting at? Like, why is the sense that it's getting not just a little bit worse, but exponentially worse? So
here's a couple of things. Number one, crime is down, and it has been. It went up during the pandemic, but here's what, just very quickly, what the problem is. Even that money is not enough to deal with the problem. And what really accelerates the perception is the increase in the unhoused, right? And sort of the social disorder you see in the streets. Drug use in our country and our community is growing. It has grown for years. The difference is, middle class, upper class people use drugs in the privacy of their homes. They don't get arrested by the police. The unhoused is doing it in front of all of us. They get jacked up. And we see that, right? And it's disturbing to us. And then that combined with mental health epidemic, because we shut down our mental health institutions about 40 years ago, and now we're paying the price of that. So you have sort of this perfect storm. Real estate values going way up, especially in communities like ours, which are probably the biggest driver of homelessness. Mental health problems. Over-incarceration has led to this whole generation of people that can't find employment, can't work.
Well, how much of this is an accumulation of deindustrializing our country beginning, whenever, back in the 70s, and kind of accelerating under Reagan, and then really accelerating under Clinton, and, very like the economic crash in 2008, and then COVID. I mean, just one thing after another. My understanding is that over the course of those years, when people wind up out on the street, most of them never come back. And so are we kind of in this moment historically of the chickens coming home to roost on decades of bad policy from both parties kind of across the political spectrum that people want to blame whoever's in office right now for?
Yeah, absolutely. This taken decades to get us here. If you look at mental health, right, very quickly, we know that we shut down mental institutions back in the 80s. And then we didn't have a place to put them, so we put people in the jails. And then we say, well, the jails is not a good place for them. We can't build enough jails, so now we put them on the street, right? If you look at public housing, let's just say public housing. There was more public housing per capita in this country in the early 1980s, late 1970s that there is today, right? And that used to be like the safety net, sort of the last place where the poor people could go, as public housing or a Section 8 voucher, right? That has gone away in so many different ways. At the same time that our real estate value has continued to grow way above any increases in salary or, increases in inflation. I mean, real estate just outstrip almost everything else, right? So the affordability of houses goes up, or the affordability goes down, actually. The price of houses go down. You have less public housing. You have more people that cannot find employment because they have a criminal record that we created with the war on drugs and all this stuff. All this is coming together now. And this is a crisis that we're facing.
So I know there's a lot of debate as to what exactly drives crime rates to move up or down. Yeah. But what do you think it is? What do you think the key factors that drive?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the poor education system, poor public health, and certainly a broken down criminal legal system, they're all contributing factors to the problem. I have to tell you also that I know the perception that crime is up, but actually crime was way worse 20 years ago than it is today. We had an uptick during
That's
the
a
pandemic.
nationwide trend, isn't it?
Yeah, that
It's
nationwide
moving
trend.
down. Right,
nationwide.
yeah.
We had a
Is there much fluctuation, just out of curiosity, between cities like Los Angeles, where you're, we have a progressive DA, and cities where there's a more tough on crime DA?
Yeah, there is actually.
Is there much of a difference in terms of these crime rate trends?
Yeah, I mean, we know, for instance, southern states that are very hardcore, tough on crime have higher crime rates than New York, L.A., San Francisco. We have lower per capita crime rates in L.A. County than Kern County, San Bernardino, Riverside, that are counties that are, being run by very tough on crime prosecutors. So the answer is yes, actually, the more tough on crime environment that you have, generally, the more the crime is up. Per capita, if you take the city of LA, and remember, right, I'm a county guy, right? So we have 88 cities, but you take LA City, they get compared with all the major cities around the country. When it comes to violence, we're like way down, right? But compared to most cities like Houston, Memphis, cities in the South, they have substantially higher per capita rates of violence and all that stuff, but people don't see that because the local media and the cops are not beating their prosecutor over there because crime is up.
Interesting.
And by the way, those are not my numbers.
Right. Where do crime rate statistics come from? Who generates those?
Yeah, well, generally speaking, it goes from police departments reporting to the Department of Justice, and the FBI crunches the national numbers. And, we get reports, and they're trying actually, it used to be that you really only got good numbers once a year. They're trying actually to come up more regularly because they understand that there's always this hunger for numbers. Now, in the city of LA, we're very fortunate. LAPD actually has a very good number crunching system, so you can go on their website and you can see where crime is by police station. Sheriff Department does too, not quite as regularly. And then smaller agencies, they're all a little different.
This whole conversation, it just opens up so many more questions. I could just sit here and
we can do this again
pick your brain forever. But I do want to ask you if there's any policy changes that you instituted while you've been in office that you now think differently about or would do differently.
Yeah, I mean, look, when I first became the district attorney, I came in a very hostile environment and in a very heavily civil service process where I could not move people. I could not even bring my own team, which, you talk to anybody that runs organizations, you mean you come into a new place, and I tell people, here's what I want you to look. Think about Joe Biden coming in 2020, say, congratulations, Mr. President, you're now the President of the United States. But by the way, you're going to keep Donald Trump's cabinet, right? That was my experience. So we put, and I said we because this is the work of a lot of people, put very tightly written policies with very little exceptions because we didn't want the exceptions to swallow the rule. Since then, we have loosened up a lot, and we have also, quite frankly, created vehicles for exceptions, and we have committees that can analyze a lot of the work and determine, Should we go harder on this particular issue or this case or this person? So we're a very different office today than we were when I first became the DA. But, by and large, I would say that the biggest failure on my part, if I was going to take, it was my lack of clear communication with the community of what we were doing, being more out there in the media, doing more public communication. We set up great community forums where we brought people into the workplace to help us develop policies. But I was not out there. It's a county of 10 million people. We'll be like the largest 8th or 9th state, I think, in the country.
But isn't that always the challenge for reformers, that, simplistic, tough on crime messages just sell so much easier, and the real conversation is so much more difficult and nuanced, detailed?
100%. Look how much time we spend today, right? And we've only scratched the surface.
Right. Yeah.
You could have my opponent here today tell you, well, all I'm going to do is I'm going to lock everybody up to the maximum the law allows. And, we're going to, if you are in prison, we're going to make sure you stay there the longest possible. And that's going to fix your problem. We have a 5-minute podcast. Right?
Well, what happens if Hochman wins and Prop 36 passes? What happens? Do all the reforms you've instituted go away that day, or what? What's the outcome of that?
He's actually promised that he would unwind all the reforms immediately. So those are not my words; those are his. He's been very public about it. So yeah, they would go away. And if Prop 36 were to pass, probably you won't see it immediately, but I think within a year or two, you're going to see our prison population go up, and you're going to start seeing people again for simple possession of drugs going to jail. Because again, people that are using drugs are not they don't think they're going to get arrested, and if they're addicted, they're going to get arrested 1, 2, and the third time, boom, you're going to go to prison.
I hear that a lot. Like, criminals know that you can't get arrested for this and that, so then that's why crime goes up. That seems a little fantastical to me. Do you think criminals are paying that close attention to the nuances of the law?
No, I don't think, especially the folks that are committing like a regular street crime, they never think they're going to get caught. By the way, because they don't get caught, right? It's not that they don't get prosecuted. People say, well, no, it's not that they don't get prosecuted. They don't get caught. Look, if you're a burglar, you have about an 85% chance that you're not going to be arrested by the police, right? So if you're a burglar, you probably committed many burglaries without ever being arrested. That by itself tells you that committing burglaries pays, right? I mean, it gets even worse. I mean, people don't think about this, but if you go out and commit murder, as a general rule, if you look in the United States, you're standing a 50% chance of not getting caught.
We shouldn't say that out loud on this podcast. Murder's going to go through the roof.
And, so the problem is, but on the other hand, people don't go and think I'm going to commit murder, right? They're some psychopath. The burglars will go on and think I'm going to break into your home and steal stuff because that's going to buy the next fix for drugs, or it's going to whatever it's going to do for me, right? Or the guy that commits the robberies, right? So there's a different psychology around those things.
I still am struggling to understand why people blame you.
Well, that's a question that we often ask. And if you understand the politics behind incarceration and around policing and all that stuff, then it becomes obvious why that is. And then, frankly, you can go back to the 80s, or even earlier, from Nixon and up, right? The fear-mongering about crime, and the war on drugs and, all these wars that we've created, right? They have an audience, and they result in political gain.
It's marketing.
It's marketing.
Yeah, it's just marketing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
My pleasure.
Mr.
Thank you.
District Attorney, I
George,
appreciate it.
Please.
George,
yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that
appreciate
was great.
the opportunity.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Love to do it again another time when you guys have the moment and you're willing to put up with my
Hey, listen, when I post this and get a bunch of angry comments, like I always get when I post anything remotely political, then I'll make a bunch of questions from that, and we'll do it again.
Next time we'll do the guitar stuff, right?
There you go.
I'll bring my written material in.
Awesome.